The sound is small, almost lost in the growing symphony of a city coming apart. It is the sound of a key, turning in the lock of a steel safe for the very last time. It's a sound of finality, a quiet mechanical click that signifies the end of a 30-year American project. Inside the safe there is nothing left to protect. The codes have been burned, their ashes stirred into a grey paste. The files filled with the names of agents, collaborators and friends, names that are now death sentences, have been fed into the incinerator, their smoke a greasy black plume rising into the humid morning air. The man turning the key doesn't pause to reflect. There is no time. Beyond the reinforced walls of his office, a world is dissolving. This is Saigon, April 29th, 1975. For years, this city was an island of frantic energy, a bubble of American influence filled with soldiers and spies, journalists and contractors, diplomats and hustlers. It was the nerve center of a war that had consumed a generation, a place of sidewalk cafes and sandbagged villas, of breathtaking corruption and breathtaking courage. They called it the Pearl of the Orient. Now, it is a pressure cooker, and the lid is about to blow off. Outside, the streets are a tangled mess of fear and motion. The lucky ones, the well-connected, are already gone. The rest are caught in a vast, sprawling panic. The city's 3.5 million residents are joined by over 1 million refugees who have flooded in from the collapsing provinces, carrying with them stories that sound like premonitions. They speak of the unstoppable advance of the North Vietnamese Army, the T-54 tanks that chew up roads and spit out fire, the endless columns of soldiers in pith helmets marching south with a discipline born of decades of war. This is not a retreat, it is a rout. The South Vietnamese Army, once one of the largest and best equipped in the world, is evaporating like mist in the tropical sun. For weeks, the American ambassador, Graham Martin, had held on to a desperate hope. He believed in a negotiated settlement, a managed transition, anything but the spectacle of a panicked American flight. He was a proud, stubborn man, haunted by the memory of his own son, a soldier killed in Vietnam years earlier. To admit that it was all for nothing, to preside over this final humiliating collapse, it was unthinkable. And so he hesitated. He resisted the calls for a mass evacuation, fearing it would trigger the very panic he sought to avoid. He kept assuring Washington and himself that there was still time. But time had run out. The day before, the North Vietnamese began their final assault on Tan Son Nhut Air Base, the last viable runway, the last artery for an orderly escape. Rockets slammed into the tarmac, killing 2 of the last American Marines to die in the war. The giant C-130s, the workhorses that had been flying thousands out each day, could no longer land or take off. The airport, the symbol of American power and the primary escape route, was now a smoking ruin. The promise of a calm, dignified departure was gone. There was only one option left, an option so chaotic, so dangerous, it was considered the absolute last resort. They called it Operation Frequent Wind. It would be the largest helicopter evacuation in human history. How did it come to this? How did a superpower, after investing billions of dollars in the lives of more than 58,000 of its young men and women, find itself trapped, reduced to a frantic last-ditch airlift from the rooftops of a besieged city? The answer lay not in the jungles of Vietnam, but in the corridors of power back in Washington. The Paris Peace Accords, signed just 2 years earlier in 1973, were supposed to be the end of it. It was Nixon's peace with honor. American troops came home, prisoners of war were released, and a fragile ceasefire was declared. But woven into that peace was a solemn promise made to the South Vietnamese government. If North Vietnam violated the treaty and launched a full-scale invasion, the United States would respond with the full force of its air power. America would be their salvation. But America was tired. The war had torn the country apart. The Watergate scandal had shattered the nation's trust in its government, and in August 1974 had driven Richard Nixon from office. The new president, Gerald Ford, inherited a nation with no appetite for re-engagement. Congress, reflecting the will of the people, had already passed laws forbidding any further American military action in Vietnam. When the final North Vietnamese offensive began in the spring of 1975, President Ford pleaded with Congress for emergency aid for the South. He begged them to honor the promise. The answer was a resounding no. The money was cut off. The bombers would not be coming back. The promise was broken. And so the dominoes began to fall, faster than even the most pessimistic analysts had predicted. The provincial capitals of the Central Highlands fell in a matter of days. Then came the catastrophic collapse of Da Nang, a city where terrified soldiers trampled women and children to claw their way onto the last planes and boats. The images from Da Nang were a horrifying preview of what could happen in Saigon. Yet Ambassador Martin held fast, his denial a fortress against the encroaching reality. Now, that fortress had crumbled. With the airport closed, the only way out was up. The plan called for American helicopters, Sea Knights and Jolly Green Giants from the aircraft carriers of the 7th Fleet waiting just offshore to ferry thousands of people from designated landing zones inside the city. The primary zone was the sprawling defense attaché's office compound at the Tan Son Nhut Air Base. The secondary, and most desperate, was the American Embassy itself, a 6-block fortress in the heart of the city, with a helipad on its roof designed for a single helicopter. The problem was not just the 3,000 Americans still left in the country, it was the others. The tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, of South Vietnamese who had staked their lives on an American victory. They were interpreters, clerks, intelligence assets, government officials, military officers, and their families. They had American blood on their hands in the eyes of the coming regime. Leaving them behind was not just a betrayal, it was a death sentence. And every single one of them knew it. So on the morning of April 29th, a secret signal was prepared. It was a message to be broadcast on American radio service, a signal intended for the ears of the remaining Americans and a select few Vietnamese to tell them the final evacuation was on. The chosen message was both surreal and hauntingly inappropriate for the tropical heat of Saigon. The station was to play Bing Crosby's White Christmas. When that song came over the airwaves, it meant, go to your designated pickup points. Go now. The final curtain was falling. The city held its breath, a vast ocean of humanity trapped between a failed promise and an arriving army. The signal was about to be given. The signal was given at 10:51 on the morning of April 29th. The voice of Bing Crosby, crooning about treetops glistening and sleigh bells in the snow, became the starting pistol for the largest helicopter evacuation in history. But this was not an operation of sentiment. It was an undertaking of pure, brutal engineering. While the city held its breath, a different kind of machine, a vast logistical organism, roared to life 60 miles offshore in the South China Sea. This was Task Force 76 of the United States 7th Fleet, a floating, self-contained nation-state of steel with a singular purpose. At its core were the aircraft carriers, USS Midway, USS Hancock, USS Enterprise, and the command ship USS Blue Ridge. These were not merely ships. They were mobile industrial zones. Deep in their cavernous hulls, they carried the lifeblood of the entire operation, JP-5 jet fuel. The fleet had stockpiled over 1.5 million gallons of it, a quantity measured not in barrels, but in thousands of tons. This fuel represented potential energy on an almost incomprehensible scale, waiting to be converted into noise, heat, and the vertical lift required to pluck thousands of souls from a collapsing city. Every component of the evacuation, every decision made by pilots and planners, would be dictated by the unyielding mathematics of fuel consumption. The primary instruments of this rescue were two distinct yet complementary pieces of aviation hardware. The heavy lifter was the Marine Corps' CH-53 Sea Stallion, a monstrous machine powered by two General Electric T-64 turboshaft engines, each capable of producing nearly 4,000 shaft horsepower. It was a flying warehouse, designed to carry 55 fully equipped combat troops, or an internal payload of 4 tons. But on this day, its cargo was human desperation, packed shoulder to shoulder. The Sea Stallion was loud, powerful, and voracious, burning through JP-5 at a rate of nearly 600 gallons per hour. Every round trip from the fleet to Saigon and back was a carefully calculated expenditure of this finite resource, a flight plan drawn not just on a map, but on a fuel gauge. Its partner was the more nimble, though no less vital, CH-46C Nhut. A tandem rotor workhorse, the C Nhut was the logistical backbone of the Marine Corps. Lighter than the CH-53, it consumed fuel at a more manageable 350 gallons per hour and could carry around 24 people. But it possessed one critical design feature that made it indispensable in the final hours: its compact footprint. The C Nhut, with its rotors folded, could fit onto the crowded elevators and decks of an assault ship. More importantly, its landing gear configuration was the only one in the fleet's inventory that could physically, and just barely, land on the rooftop helipad of the American Embassy. The entire operation, codenamed Frequent Wind, was a symphony of controlled chaos orchestrated from the USS Blue Ridge. The plan was a relentless cycle, a circulatory system pumping helicopters into the city and back out to the ships. A sortie began in the controlled environment of a carrier deck. A CH-53, with a full internal fuel load of 100 gallons, weighing over 3.5 tons, would lift off. It would form up with AH-1 Cobra gunships, lean, predatory helicopters armed with 2.75-inch rockets, and 7 62mm miniguns, acting as armed escorts against the theoretical threat of North Vietnamese anti-aircraft fire. The flight inland was a 45-minute burn, each revolution of the 6-bladed main rotor a metronome counting down the aircraft's loiter time over the city. The primary destination was the Defense Attaché's office, the Dao compound, a sprawling complex near the Tan Son Nhut Air Base. Here, the engineering was one of crowd control and throughput. Two massive landing zones, LZ-39 and LZ-40, had been designated. They were little more than parking lots, but they became the critical interface between the ground and the air. CH-53s and CH-46 landed in waves, sometimes 4 or 5 at a time. The downdraft from a single Sea Stallion could exceed 100 miles per hour, a man-made hurricane of dust, debris, and heat that flattened anything not tied down. Marines on the ground formed human funnels, forcing panicked crowds into disciplined lines, counting heads, and pushing them up the rear ramp of the helicopters before they could be overwhelmed. The goal was to keep the aircraft on the ground for less than 60 seconds. Every extra second spent with engines running was a waste of precious fuel and an invitation for disaster. While the DAO compound represented a large-scale, brute force solution, the embassy was a problem of surgical precision. The helipad on its roof was a small concrete circle, engineered in the 1960s to support a single 9,000-pound Bell UH-1 Huey. The pilots of Marine Helicopter Squadron 165 were now being asked to land a CH-46C Nhut on it, a machine weighing over 25,000 pounds fully loaded. The margin for error was non-existent. The pilot had to approach, hover, and descend with the rear landing gear just inches from the edge of the roof. A miscalculation would not just lose an aircraft, it would send 25,000 pounds of metal, fuel, and humanity crashing through 6 stories of the embassy building. The heat from the twin General Electric T-58 engines blasted the rooftop, cooking the tar and threatening to ignite the fuel vapor. Each landing was a controlled structural stress test, repeated again and again for hours on end. Back on the ships, the logistical chain was running in reverse. As a helicopter landed, its engines still whining, a swarm of flight deck personnel descended upon it. The blue shirts, aircraft handlers, chocked the wheels and chained the aircraft to the deck. The purple shirts, the fuel specialists, dragged heavy hoses and began the process of hot refueling, pumping hundreds of gallons of JP5 back into the tanks while the engines and rotors were still turning, a dangerous but time-saving necessity. The entire process from touchdown to takeoff was designed to take less than 15 minutes. Simultaneously, the human cargo was offloaded. These were not soldiers, they were civilians in a state of shock, many having not eaten or slept for days. The immediate need was physiological stabilization. The first thing they received was water, handed out by sailors in an assembly line. The second was calories. The galleys of the USS Midway, designed to feed a crew of 4,000, went into overdrive, producing thousands of servings of boiled rice and bread. It was simple, high-carbohydrate sustenance, the most efficient way to deliver energy to malnourished bodies. Each evacuee represented a new and unplanned drain on the fleet's resources of potable water and food stores, a logistical challenge that would grow exponentially with every arriving helicopter. The entire operation was a massive, desperate conversion of fossil fuels into human salvation, one sortie, 1 ton of steel, and 1 bowl of rice at a time. It was the most complex, expensive, and chaotic feat of engineering the world had ever seen, all unfolding in the skies above a dying city. But for every soul lifted into the sky, thousands remained trapped on the earth below. The logistical miracle unfolding on the decks of the 7th Fleet was an abstraction, a distant planetary system viewed through the wrong end of a telescope. Down in the streets of Saigon, the currency was not JP5 fuel or tons of steel. It was a last handful of piastres for a bottle of water, a place in a line, a moment of shade. The cost of the evacuation wasn't measured in dollars, but in the slow, grinding erosion of the human body and spirit. Here, the engineering was of a different kind, the desperate architecture of survival. For Sergeant Bin of the 18th ARVN Division, the world had shrunk to a 4-foot section of sandbagged wall near the edge of Tan Son Nhut. For 3 days, he hadn't received a single order that made sense. Commands came over the radio, then were contradicted moments later. Now the radio was silent. He had 3 rounds left for his M16 rifle. 3. He had counted them this morning, and then an hour ago, and then again just minutes ago, as if the simple act of counting might somehow magically produce a 4th. His canteen had been empty since dawn. The thirst was a living thing inside him, a hot coal in his throat. He watched a Huey lift off from a rooftop a kilometer away, its distinctive whop-whop, a sound he had associated with salvation for a decade. Now it sounded like a door closing, over and over again, each beat a final metallic click of a lock he did not have the key for. The real enemy was no longer the Viet Cong soldier he could see in his mind's eye, but the gnawing in his own stomach. It had been 2 days since his last real meal, a cold lump of rice that tasted of motor oil. The hunger had passed through the sharp pangs of its early stages and settled into a dull, hollow ache that stole the strength from his limbs. His rifle, his trusted companion through countless firefights in the Delta, felt impossibly heavy. It was no longer a weapon. It was just a piece of metal, as useless as a stone. He saw the faces of the men he had led, men who had trusted him, scattered now. Some had simply walked away, melting back into the city to find their families. Others lay where they fell, not from enemy fire, but from the simple, crushing weight of a war that had finally run out of reasons. He was a soldier with no one to command, holding a rifle with no bullets, defending a country that no longer existed. He was a ghost, and the helicopters were just vultures circling a carcass. Miles away, in the human sea pressing against the walls of the American embassy, a woman named Thun was fighting a different kind of war. Her battlefield was a 10-square-foot patch of pavement, and her enemies were dehydration and the crushing weight of the crowd. In her arms, she held her 4-year-old son, Hyo, whose feverish warmth soaked through her thin ao dai. Her other hand was a vice locked around the wrist of her 6-year-old daughter, An. For 36 hours, they had been a part of this desperate tide, moving not in footsteps but in inches, carried by the sways and surges of the mass. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and desperation, so dense it felt like you could drown in it. The sun had been a merciless hammer all day, and now that night had fallen, a damp chill was rising from the concrete, seeping into their bones. They had nothing but the clothes they wore, the flimsy papers in Than's pocket, and a shared memory of the single sweet potato they had split between the 3 of them the morning before. Anne had stopped crying hours ago. She was now in a state of silent, wide-eyed shock, her small face smudged with dirt, her grip on her mother's hand the only anchor in a world of chaos. But Hyo had begun to whimper, a low, constant sound of misery. His lips were cracked and pale. Thang tried to shield him, to curl her own body around his, but there was no space. She was just another body pressed among thousands. She could feel the tremors of his small frame and knew he was fading. She looked up at the embassy wall, at the concertina wire glinting under the floodlights. She saw the silhouettes of the Marines on the parapet, figures from another world. They were so close, 100 feet of churning humanity away, but it might as well have been the moon. She wasn't fighting for a political ideal or a flag. She was fighting for a single cup of clean water. She was fighting for her son to see another sunrise. In her world, the $3 billion evacuation was a cruel fantasy. The only reality was the frantic, weakening pulse she could feel against her chest. On that wall, Lance Corporal Jim Avery from Dayton, Ohio, tried not to see the individual faces. He had been told to look at the crowd as a whole, a single entity, a security problem to be managed. But it was impossible. He was 19 years old, and nothing in boot camp had prepared him for this. He saw a man his father's age, in a crisp white shirt now stained with grime, holding up a leather briefcase, his face a mask of dignified pleading. Jim saw a young girl, no older than his sister, her dark eyes filled with a terror so profound it felt like he was falling into them. He had a canteen of water on his hip and 2 packs of MREs in his rucksack. To eat in front of them felt like a crime. To drink was an act of obscene privilege. Earlier in the evening, a wave in the crowd had surged forward, and an old woman had been knocked to the ground, disappearing under the feet of the desperate. Jim and his squad mates had screamed for people to back up, but their voices were swallowed by the roar. There was nothing they could do. He had seen death before in the jungle, a thing of sudden violence and finality. This was different. This was a slow, grinding death by hopelessness. The people below were not an enemy. They were allies, colleagues, civilians who had thrown their lot in with his country, and he was now the one holding the door shut. An order came down. No more locals, Americans only. He had to push back a man who had worked as a translator for the embassy for 5 years, a man Jim knew by name, a man who had a wife and children somewhere in that suffocating mass. As he pushed the man's hands off the gate, their eyes met. In that moment, Jim Avery felt the full crushing weight of his country's promise breaking in his hands. The cost wasn't in the fuel for the helicopters flying overhead. It was right here, in the shame that burned behind his eyes. It was a debt that could never be repaid. That debt was being calculated in real time, not by accountants in Washington, but by helicopter pilots flying on courage and caffeine. The turning point of the entire operation wasn't a battle or a political decision made in the final hours. It was a simple, brutal equation of fuel, time, and daylight. The sun, which had been a promise of rescue for so long, was now a threat. It was rising over the South China Sea, a silent, implacable clock. The North Vietnamese Army was no longer on the horizon. They were in the suburbs. Their tanks were idling on boulevards named for French generals and Vietnamese poets, waiting for the dawn. Inside the embassy, the exhaustion was absolute. Men who had not slept in 2 days made life or death decisions based on shouted reports and gut feelings. The final call came not from a president, but from a pilot. His voice, crackling over the radio, was devoid of emotion. He had enough fuel for one more round trip from the fleet. 1. After that, the air would fall silent. The $3 billion effort, a logistical miracle of modern warfare, had come down to a single tank of gas in a single CH-53 Sea Stallion. Ambassador Graham Martin, a man who had held on to the idea of South Vietnam with a grim and tragic tenacity, finally relented. He walked through the ravaged Chancery building, past the debris of shredded documents and smashed cipher machines. He took the American flag from its pole, folded it with a slow, deliberate precision, and tucked it under his arm. He was the last one up the ladder to the rooftop helipad, as his helicopter call sign Lady Ace 09 lifted into the hazy morning air. It banked over the city. Below him was not a capital in revolt, but a city holding its breath. The streets were quiet, the roar of the crowds at the embassy having subsided into a murmur of collective disbelief. For a brief moment from that height, Saigon looked peaceful, timeless. Then the helicopter turned east, toward the sea, and the American war in Vietnam was over. The embassy was no longer an embassy. It was just a building, a tombstone marking a 30-year investment of blood and treasure. On the ground, the silence was the first shock. For 48 hours, the sky had been filled with the percussive thumping of rotor blades, a sound that had meant hope for some and abandonment for others. Now there was nothing. only the distant rumble of engines and the rustle of a wind carrying the scent of diesel and rain. The gates of the presidential palace, less than a mile away, were breached, not with a thunderous explosion, but with a simple metallic crunch. A North Vietnamese T-54 tank rolled onto the lawn, its red and gold-starred flag a stark slash of color against the palace's white facade. There was no final battle for Saigon. The city didn't fall. It was simply handed over, like a set of keys to a house whose owners had fled in the night. In the days that followed, the land itself seemed to bear the scars. The embassy compound was a landscape of desperation. Thousands of abandoned shoes littered the courtyard. Single shoes, children's sandals, the high heels of a diplomat's wife, each one a story without an end. The swimming pool was filled with discarded weapons and briefcases, their contents floating on the murky water like forgotten memories. Inside, sensitive documents, torn but not destroyed, swirled in the breeze, clinging to the wrought iron gates like strange white leaves. It was the archaeology of a failed promise. The very soil seemed saturated with the weight of it all, a ground that had soaked up too much history, too much sorrow. For those who left, the scar was a phantom limb, a sense of a place they could never return to, a life severed mid-sentence. For those who stayed, the scars were more immediate: re-education camps, lost fortunes, and the quiet, gnawing fear of a new order. For soldiers like Jim Avery, the scar was invisible, a memory burned onto the soul. He would see the translator's face for the rest of his life, in dreams, in the faces of strangers in a supermarket in Dayton, Ohio. He had been the final gear in a vast, indifferent machine, the human hand that had enforced the cold logic of the final equation. He, and thousands of men like him, became the quiet custodians of their country's broken promise. History does not end. It simply changes shape, its echoes finding new valleys to fill. The fall of Saigon was not an end point, but a point of dispersal. It scattered a people across the globe, creating new communities in Houston, in Paris, in Sydney. It sent a generation of American veterans home to a country that did not want to hear their stories. The war didn't just shape a nation, it shaped millions of individual silences, millions of private griefs. The land remembers. The red earth of the Central Highlands, the muddy water of the Mekong, the humid air of Saigon. They hold the memory. The cost of that war was never truly $3 billion. That was just the price of the evacuation. The real cost is measured in the quiet spaces between then and now, in the stories that are still being told by the children and grandchildren of those who were there. It is a sound you can still hear if you listen closely, in the silence that follows a promise when it breaks.